This video will provide a final review of the Geography CSEC paper, paper 2, just pointing out some key things in preparation or to be mindful of in terms of the exam itself, and of course just um, regarding certain topics that will be found in the various questions, and of course strategies to answer the questions. Just to be mindful that you should be going into the exam already knowing what are the instructions associated with the paper. There are going to be 4 questions. You have to answer all of the questions. You have to write all of your answers in the spaces provided. There are going to be margins. You are not to write on those margins. As best as possible, you have to write within the space that is provided for you. On that note, do not see the number of lines as that you have to answer all or use all of your lines to answer questions. It basically, the space with the lines given to you should represent the maximum amount that is expected for the answer, right? Not necessarily meaning that you have to fill up. Quality is always going to be more important than quantity in terms of answering these questions, right? Of course, in the based on the type of question, you are going to be given credit for using illustrations like maps and diagrams. You can work with and should, depending on the question, use a calculator. You are to use your geometrical instruments, particularly your protractor is going to be a key one, and of course a ruler. If by chance you may need to use the extra space at the back of the booklet, be mindful that it's only for one question or part of a question. It is not for you to answer the different parts of 2 or 3 questions. One page of the extra page sheet is for entire question or part of a question, right? And of course, where you're using the extra pages at the back, clearly write the number, the question number and part in the box at the top of the page, right? Just remind you of the nature of the 4 questions. So of course, the first question is going to be a map skills question. 12 marks of the 25 marks are going to be based on practical skills. To remind you on practical skills you are going to be, of course, tested on grid referencing, particularly 6-figure, but they could still ask questions on the 4-figure. Remember, in the easterns, up stated before, the northerns, the easterns, of course, the vertical lines, the northerns are the horizontal lines. Remember, there is no space in between the digits. They're all written figure by figure next to each other. You are expected to know all 16 cardinal points, because direction questions are going to be based on that, not on the regular east, northeast, or south, but all of the 16 cardinal points. Grid bearings, of course, there's a corresponding bearing for each of the cardinal point. Note that it is, but of course, knowing very well that you have to use your protractor to measure the exact the bearings, and of course, it's going to be measured in a clockwise direction. Also be mindful that the questions could, instead of saying the word grid bearing, it could also come as compass bearing or angular bearing, or could it just say bearing? Compass direction could also be phrase cardinal point, right? Of course, using a string, if you need to measure how a curve feature like a road or a river, or of course you could use your ruler and measure distance between 2 points in a straight line distance. But remember, if you're using a ruler, you have to use the scale of the map, the linear scale, to do your measurements. And of course, remembering everything to the right of the 0 is kilometers. Any distances in between 2 whole numbers on the right-hand side of the scale is to be measured on that difference between the 2 whole numbers, supposed to be measured on the left-hand side of the 0, which is the meter scale. Remember, meters are fractions of kilometers, right? Not necessarily you will need to copy, but sometimes you may need to add certain things from the map onto an insert. So of course, sometimes depending on the insert question, you may have to reduce the scale or not. Remembering, if you're asked to reduce the scale, if your question says to half a scale means you're reducing the scale, right? It means that if the scale of the map is 1 to 25,000, half in it means we multiply by 2, because now it will be a 1 to 50,000 scale, which will show less detail, right? If you are doubling the scale and it's a 1 to 25,000 scale, you divide by 2, because you're zooming in to the scale. Remember, the smaller the denominator in the scale, the larger it is, meaning it will be a smaller area, but you get a lot more detail being shown. So be mindful of that depending on what the questions may ask. cross sections and cross sketch maps sometimes of cross sections mean be arcs. All of these are still part of practical skills. Calculating of gradients, of course, remembering it's a ratio in geography. The vertical distance in height as a ratio to horizontal distance between 2 points. Sometimes they may give you all of the units or all of the measurements and you have to input it in a formula, or you may have to go to the map, look at the contours, read off the heights of respective points on the contour lines, and then do the horizontal distance between 2 points and calculate. They could also ask about slopes. Remember, you have steep slopes if the contours are close to each other, gentle slopes if their space is wider, or moderate if they're in between, or uniform if their space are relatively uniform. Of course, remembering you could talk about if there's no contour lines, it's a flat area, and talk about the if it's steep or gently sloping or moderate sloping, again, depending on the kind of questions you may ask. And of course, sometimes you may be asked to illustrate some of the physical features, not necessarily in a map book question, but sometimes it could be asked in the regular paper, the rest of the paper. Describing, which could come as a knowledge and comprehension. So, of course, knowledge and comprehension, there will be 7 marks. It could be 2 or 3 3 questions that total the 7 marks. For knowledge and comprehension, they will ask you specific points about the map where they may be asking you to describe like drainage, or describe the settlement patterns, or describe the road networks, or they probably may ask you to describe the relief, or identify services provided, or functions of areas, or identify crops grown, cultivation grown, or types of vegetation. Those are all knowledge and comprehension. So, of course, with relief, you can sometimes describe the distribution in terms of where places are in steepness or gentleness or flatness, heights of areas, the highest point in an area, types of settlements, types of slopes, and different types of relief features. Or if it was drainage, you may be asked to talk about its patterns, its density, the direction of flow, quality of drainage, the shape or the size of the channels. The land use, is the land use being used for cultivation, or is it used for natural vegetation, is it used for industrial activity, transport, settlements, etc. And of course, all of these things could be asked as describing the distribution, describing how things are. But when for the 6-mark question in the map question, is usually be one question where they may ask you to use that knowledge. They may ask you to explain why are certain things where they are. Explain the distribution of houses. Why are the houses located where they are located? Or why is there no houses in certain places? Or why is there cultivation where there is or not, or where there may not be cultivation? Those are kind of the explanation questions. What's the relationship between the relief and settlements, the relief and roads, the relief and cultivation, the interrelationships? They could ask as explanation. But more importantly, with the map book question, please remember evidence must be provided from the map. Whether you're quoting place names, whether you're quoting grid referencing, which they particularly prefer, quote grid referencing, quote western part, eastern part. Don't say top and left and right of map. Use the cardinal points to the left of the map, to the right of the map, or the map extract, right? Northeastern, southeastern. Use the grid referencing to give you an example. The lack of evidence from the map will mean that you will not get your full marks. And the evidence is particularly required for the knowledge and comprehension and the use of knowledge questions, depending on how they bring it. So be prepared for that. It's an easy 25 marks to get, even though map work may seem to be very difficult. But once you understand the basic concepts associated with map work, it is a relatively easy 25 marks to get. But of course, it requires time for you to analyze the map, analyze the questions, and make connections. But remember, particularly for the use of knowledge and the knowledge and comprehension question, if they ask you to describe things or explain things, provide the evidence of the map. Remember, when they ask to describe, you're basically stating where things are and where they are not. But when they ask to explain, you're giving the reasons why, given that underlying reasoning of explaining why things are where they're located. Reasons why you might find cultivation near to rivers. Why is that so? The cultivation is on flat land. Why is that so? Mostly nucleated is on flat land. Why is that so? That is where the use of knowledge and the explanation comes into play. The second question is going to be natural systems. And of course, natural systems is the largest section in the entire syllabus, and it requires everything from internal forces to right down to natural hazards and disasters. There is no saying or hint of what could come, because again, it's a large component of the syllabus. But again, it's important that you understand the basic concepts associated with certain topics, and even you can expand on those. So, of course, in the structure of lithosphere, plate tectonics, and rock formation, of course, understanding the Earth's internal structure, the differences between continental and oceanic plates, understanding what plate tectonics involves, right? Understanding how plate tectonics gives explanation to the plate margins, the different types of plate margins, right? The features found at different plate margins, and how those in turn influence the occurrence of earthquakes, the occurrence of volcanoes. Of course, the relationship between acidic and basic lava and its shape and the explosiveness of volcanoes. Why are some volcanoes found at certain plate margins and not others? Why there are three types of convergent boundaries, and again, that's related to the types of plates. You have two types of plates. You have three different ways in which the interaction can happen. You can have two continental plates moving towards each other, two oceanic plates moving towards each other, a continental and oceanic, and they could have different landforms format there at those different margins, right? Understand those relationships. Understand types of faults: normal fault, reverse fault, transform fault, right? Fold mountains are formed at collision margins where two continental plates meet, or they could also form at subduction zones where oceanic and a continental plate meet, right? Examples in the world, and these are examples of fold mountains form at subduction. Himalayas are an example of a fold mountains form due to collision, right? Understand that collision is the term for two continental plates. Subduction is when you have an oceanic and a continental, and the oceanic subducting meaning the continental. Even with two oceanic plates, there's subduction, but there's a difference between an oceanic continental and an oceanic oceanic. Oceanic subduction takes place on the seabed, and that's the reason why you don't get fold mountains forming, because there's no continental plate involved. When you have an oceanic subduction below continental, you fold mountain form on the continental plate. So what you get, those high areas of relief in oceanic are basically volcanic in nature. They're volcanoes. But understanding those relationships, right? Understanding the rock cycle and the different types of rocks and how you can get from one type of rock to the next type of rock. It's all part of that section. In terms of across the board, your definitions, if you're asked to define weathering, in situ must be part of it. Understanding that under physical weathering, you must know force action, and also known as freeze-thaw, and also exfoliation, also known as temperature change, also known as onion peeling. Understand with physical weathering, the location, the climatic characteristics of the location plays a big role. In exfoliation, arid region, there's a difference in the temperatures during the day and the night, right? In force action, you must have areas of water, but you must also have areas where the temperatures will drop and increase to allow the freezing and the thawing to occur. With chemical weathering, carbonation or hydrolysis, water is a big component. Water must be there in order to interact with the rock. Right? In terms of carbonation, the water is a slight acid because it's carbonic acid, and that changes the chemical properties of limestone, the calcium carbonate component. In hydrolysis, the water itself interacts with certain minerals in the rock, particularly gypsum rock, and breaks it down. So you have to understand that water plays a big role in chemical weathering. Biological weathering, plants and animals could break down rocks chemically or physically. But in both cases, what they do is that they increase the surface area of the rocks, and that allows it to be further subjected to the physical and the chemical weathering processes. Understand even with mass movement is also known as mass wasting. Right? You have slow types like soil creep, fast types like landslides. What causes these things? Right? The gradient of the slope plays a big role, but also the water content also plays a big role. Soil creep, you can't literally watch a slope creeping. There's evidence that you have to look at, right? The leaning pole, the leaning walls, the terracets forming, right? Those kind of examples. With landslides, you could see that. Landslides can be formed, and even with soil creep, they can be worsened or increased by the amount of water, right? If you have heavy rainfall, undercutting of the slope, earthquakes could trigger that, deforestation could trigger that. All of those things you need to be mindful of in the event they bring that. With limestone, you need to know surface features, subsurface features. What are the features formed on the surface? And the syllabus clearly identifies which are the ones on the surface. So they could ask you to describe them, or they could ask you to explain how they are formed. Right? Describing means you basically indicate this, literally given the features. How do you know what a stalactite is? Describe it. Right? Or how is a pillar? Describe it. If you're asked an explanation question, how any features form, you also have to add a description, but also go into the processes involved. What needs to happen first, then second, then third, then fourth, to to form this particular feature, right? So know what are the surface features, what are the subsurface features, know what are the characteristics of the rock itself of limestone that make it susceptible, right? Knowing that the chemical properties of the rock itself, its porosity, its permeability, its rock structure, all of those play a big role, right? Understand where in the Caribbean you have limestone, right? Jamaica country, Barbados, Hobson's Cave, etc. Right? Understand weather and climate, big part of vegetation and soil, right? Understanding those factors influence the elements of weather and climate, understanding the difference between weather and climate, the temporal difference, what factors influence different elements, the role of latitude and altitude, and looking at some of those elements, right? Understanding characteristics of your equatorial and your tropical marine environment in terms of rainfall characteristics, temperature characteristics, the weather conditions associated with weather systems, right? The tropical waves, the hurricanes, and the cold fronts. As you could see in the syllabus said, you must know the before, during, and after, because those are systems that form and they take a while, and then there's something happens before, then there's a during part, and then there's the after part. So know how these systems are formed, what the conditions necessary, and what's the weather associated with them. With the other two, the intertropical convergence zone and anticyclones, it's really more of what is the weather associated, because they just happen. There's no leading process that form them. The ICZ is always there in terms of there's convergence of the northeast and the southeast trade winds, but it changes depending on the type of time of the year, right? Understanding that some of these systems affect a lot of the Caribbean, some only affect certain parts of the Caribbean. For example, the ICZ doesn't go past Trinidad and Tobago, right? Anticyclones are really more by Bahamas and up there, right? They don't find anticyclones lower down. The others, like tropical waves, hurricanes, and cold fronts, could basically impact a lot of the other parts of the Caribbean, right? So, and also the temporal differences. The ITCZ only interacts with Trinidad between like now until probably November, right? There's a temporal difference, a time frame. Hurricanes, June to November. Anticyclones, there's no real time frame. Cold fronts in the Caribbean are predominantly between December and March, which corresponds to the winter in the northern hemisphere, North American continent. Tropical waves are again also associated with the hurricane season. So also know there's location, but there's also time. Understand the greenhouse effect, the role of the insolation and the shortwave radiation and the longwave radiation and that trapping of the heat. What contributes to global warming? Human activities. What are the consequences and measures to reduce the effects? And case studies are required. You need to know what happens in the Caribbean and what is happening in either the UK or the US, right? The textbook, generally, I think Wilson focuses on the United Kingdom, so you could look at that, but you just need to know what are some of the potential consequences of global warming in the future between the Caribbean and the United States or UK, whichever one you want to choose, and some of the ways that can be mitigated currently or in the future, right? And of course, the adaptations of the vegetation in the equatorial, marine, and tropical, equatorial mostly, right? And remember, if you understand the characteristics of the weather and the climate in those areas, the temperature characteristics, the rainfall characteristics, then it will help you better understand why the vegetation has to adapt certain ways, how it has to adapt to the excessive rainfall and the high temperatures. That is what you have to be make those connections and the interrelationships, as they say, between the climate and the vegetation and the soil formation. Lactosoils. Again, how does the climate in the equatorial region facilitate some of the soil processes? Why is there a lot of leaching, right? Why is there a lot of the coloration of the soil profiles? All of those relationships need to be understood as well. Then, of course, understanding the fluvial and coastal processes, the water cycle, know all the processes. And the syllabus clearly identifies what you need to know, the major processes, but also the consequences of the water cycle, the springs and aquifers and water tables, right? What are the different parts of the water zones, the water table being the upper limit of the zone of permanent saturation, aquifer rock structures that could hold water, springs, natural occurrences through which underground water comes to the surface. All of those are consequences of the water cycle. What are the different river processes? What are the different wave processes? And you can see here they talk about describe. So you might get those questions as knowledge and comprehension questions, where they may ask you to describe 2 or 3 river processes or coastal processes, understanding specifically what is They may ask you specifically corrosion or corrosion, or they may ask you general. Describe two types of this or two types of that, etc. And you see when they come to the explain, then it means for these questions, you need this might be the use of knowledge, where explain how a particular river field landform is formed, right? And these are the main one that they want you to know about for both rivers and coasts. So how are they formed? It's particularly with rivers, which part of the course, upper course, lower course, middle course? Is it a depositional feature? Is it a mostly erosional feature? Is it a combination? Same thing with coast. Is it a depositional feature, erosional feature? What are the processes involved? Depending, because if it is a erosional feature, then some of the erosional processes play a big role. If it's a depositional feature, then launch or drift should be part of the transporting the materials to then deposit. What are the conditions necessary for those depositional processes to occur? Like drainage patterns, which comes a lot mostly in the map work, but it could come in the question too, where they may actually draw dendritic pattern or trellis pattern, understanding that dendritic and trellis are all associated with the rock type, the geology. The radial is dependent on the topography, the height of the area, the types of reef, right? The fringing barrier, actually characteristics of them. How could you differentiate a barrier from a fringing, right? What are the conditions necessary for their formation? Question probably you got a lot of before, but what is needed, right? This could come as a use of, knowledge and comprehension, describe. Then the explanations here, use of knowledge, how coral is beneficial to man and to the natural ecosystems, the importance of mangroves. So you could use this document, which of course is on the classroom. When you see the word describe, it means in this section, which is the specific objectives, it means that it may come as a use of knowledge question. But then when you see the word explain, describe would be a knowledge and comprehension question. But when you see the word explain here, that means it could come as a use of knowledge, where the questions could be an elaborative form. So when it comes to coral reef, you could see an explanation question about how explain 3 ways in which coral reefs are important, right? And of course, explain 3 ways in which mangroves are important. So those could come as the 6-mark questions. But when you see describe questions, that means those could come as knowledge and comprehension, right? Natural hazards and natural disasters. The last part of this section, you must be able to know what's the difference between natural hazard and natural disaster. Remember, if the natural event does not have the potential to cause any sort of threat or injury or loss of property to anybody, then it's not a hazard. A hazard is only a hazard once it has the potential to impact somebody. So if you have an area and you have a natural event and there's nobody in the area, that means it's not a hazard because it has no potential, no possibility of injuring or impacting anybody. But if somebody is there, then it is a hazard to that person. Once the effects of the hazard has been beyond the capability of the individual to respond, then it becomes a disaster. Understand those differences. Understand how to classify different types of hazards. At this level, you have 5 to learn, right? And they specify them here. You need to know about earthquakes, hurricanes, volcanoes, landslides, and flooding. What are some of the effects associated with these things? How do you respond to them using, and of course, the disaster management cycle? Remember, you have the mitigation, your preparation, your response, and your recovery. How do you mitigate specifically against each of them? Remember, unless the question is general, the mitigation strategies for hurricane has to be different to volcanic eruption. They can't be the same, right? There may be broad headings that are similar, but the specific activities in those broad headings will vary because all hazards are unique in their occurrences, etc. So you must be aware of what are the specific impacts, the primary and secondary effects of those hazards. What are some of the ways in which it could be mitigated, or you could prepare for them or respond to them specifically to the hazard? What are parts of the Caribbean or parts of a country in the Caribbean that can be impacted by specific types? Right, Barbados and Trinidad and Tobago and Jamaica and the Great Antilles, there can be a direct threat of a volcanic eruption because they don't have volcanoes. But Grenada could have a direct impact. St. Vincent, right? Barbados may not have a direct impact from earthquakes because they're not really near to the margin. Same thing with Bahamas. So you need to know also where in the Caribbean you have these particular hazards, right? So for the question 2, the natural system questions, the first 5 marks are going to be on practical skills. It could be to draw a diagram or to draw a map or to draw some statistical illustration like a line graph, a bar graph. They give you data, draw a line graph, a bar graph, whatever. Or label a map, or label a diagram, or interpret a map, or interpret a diagram, or a statistical illustration. And the questions are going to add up to 5 marks. Then the next questions are going to be based on knowledge and comprehension. They will total 8 marks. It could be to define something, or as you can see, describe the features associated with whatever. Describe the characteristics of a fringe and weave. Describe two characteristics or whatever. So it may be state something, list something, or it could be to describe something, but they all will total 8 marks. And then the use of knowledge is where you come into the explanation. Explain the formation of a feature or landform. Explain the consequences of phenomena. So they may actually explain 3 consequences of climate change or global warming to the Caribbean, or compare, which of course be a explanation, or explain interrelationship. Explain the relationship between the climate of an area and the soil formation in an equatorial region. Those kind of interrelation questions. So once you're able to understand those basic concepts, you can review that document. When you see the word describe under the specific objective, then that could come as a knowledge and comprehension. But the explanation question, when you see the word explain, then your use of knowledge questions are going to come under those broad areas of explanation. And you will see most of them in formation of features or consequences that may be associated with global warming or whatever. So be mindful of those things moving forward with that question 2. Question 3 is the human systems. Right? Human systems, again, 3 broad areas. You have population, economic activities, agricultural activities. Right? And of course, they include sustainable development systems, but that kind of could come along the question 4 in regards to that. So with human systems, know all your definitions, right? Some of them they specify what you should define, but some you just need to know. So even though they don't say the word define population distribution or density, still need to know what if it asks a definition. What is population distribution? What is population density? Right? But more importantly, as an explanation question, could you explain the factors that influence why people are found where they are? Why is a large distribution there, or uneven distribution there, or even distribution or density there? Right? What are some of the broad factors? You need to be able to interpret dot maps and plot maps and population maps as a practical skills. Right? Can you compare why the factors that influence population growth in the Caribbean compared to either China, India, or Nigeria? By now, you should know which country you are choosing if a question comes. Right? You don't have to learn all, just learn one. Right? What are the factors that influence? Could you compare? Right? Do you know the definitions of urbanization, urban growth, and urban sprawl? Remember, urbanization is proportional. How much of your population is living in urban areas? Urban growth looks at the growth of your population, how the population increases or changes in urban areas. Urban sprawl looks at the physical expansion or growth of urban areas. What are some of the causes of population growth? Population will grow in any country if you have a natural increase or if you have a net positive migration. Populations can grow in an urban area the same way. Populations can change whether they grow or they decline due to if you have natural increase or decrease, or depending on migration, whether it's a net positive or net negative migrational rate. So what are some of the causes like that? What are some of the things that aid in this? In terms, and particularly with migration, why do people move to certain parts of the world or to certain parts of a country? What are the push and pull factors? What are some of the consequences, negatives or positives? Remember, consequence doesn't have to be a negative. It could be a positive. So sometimes if they ask a consequence, they may have the word consequence, or they may just have a positive consequence or a negative consequence. So don't fall into the trap of only learning one type of consequence, like negative consequence. They could ask about positive consequences. Same thing with like natural hazards. Flooding and volcanic eruptions have positive aspects associated with them. Even though they may seem to be mostly negative, there are positive aspects associated with those hazards. So if a question asks about positive or negative, understand that there are positive and negative consequences. If they ask the word consequences as general, then it doesn't matter if you put positive or negative. But know those things. What are some of the problems sometimes? Benefits or problems could be a consequence, but they may specify benefit or they may specify problems. And remember, even in trying to control urbanization, the aim is not to improve the urban areas. It is try to spread the development away from the urban areas. right? So know your terms, know the consequences associated with all of these things. Because a lot of the population is that there are a lot of consequences associated with the phenomena, right? You need to just understand those consequences. And once you're able to understand those things, it should be easy to make your way through these kind of questions. With regards to economic activities, definitions, what are primary, secondary, tertiary, examples of them, what are some of the benefits associated with engaging in these types of, where in the Caribbean, even if you decide to choose your case studies under fishing or whatever, you still need to know in general where in the Caribbean certain economic activities take place, where are certain resources found in the Caribbean, where can you find gold in the Caribbean, where is bauxite done in the Caribbean, right, where is fishing active in the Caribbean, right, because you can actually draw a map of a country in the Caribbean that has a particular major resource. If you studied forestry, then you could pick Guyana. If you chose mining of bauxite in a particular country, you could pick that country. That's why whichever case study you do or you choose, you must know where in the respective territory the activity takes place. At least two place names you should know where the activities take place. So if it says in the primary with forestry, you should know where in Guyana the forestry areas are and two areas where the activities take place. If it's bauxite, where in Jamaica is a bauxite deposits are, and where is there a factory or processing plant? In Trinidad, where is the oil and gas field? Just one, you need to know where possible area and a processing plant. You need to still know because they can ask you, especially draw a sketch map of a territory where a particular primary activity or secondary activity, you need to still remember those things, right? Remember your case studies, whether you're doing fishing or forestry, not both, fishing or forestry, oil and natural gas or bauxite, right? So by now you should know which one you're doing, and you have to know food processing in the Caribbean and Singapore. Must be able to compare. What are the factors that influence them? What are some of the problems in those areas? And what are some of the things that could be done to solve those problems in those countries? Important to know those things as well. And of course, agriculture. What are the factors that influence agriculture in the Caribbean? And then, of course, what are some of the problems we are seeing now in agriculture, right? What are some of the trends we are seeing in agriculture because of some of the problems arising? What are the differences between commercial, arable, or large-scale farming and peasant farming or small-scale farming, right? There's a table I presented. You can compare the two under different headings. What is the difference between sugarcane cultivation in Guyana with sugarcane cultivation in Brazil? Again, another table is presented. Look at those headings. What are some of the trends and changes in those two countries in terms of sugarcane cultivation? The use of sugarcane cultivation now in renewable energy and for biofuels, etc. Those are the kind of things that you need to be aware of, right? And then, so with question 3, same thing, practical skills, 5 marks, give you a diagram to interpret or to draw a map, or that, whatever the case may be, statistical illustration to draw or interpret, definitions, description of characteristics of processes or features, describe 2 characteristics associated with primary activities or secondary activities of agriculture equipment, something like that, and then explain. And again, you could use the syllabus structure. When you see the word compare, it could be either as a description, knowledge and comprehension, or it could be explanation. But when you see the word explain, then it could be come out as a use of knowledge. Explain, discuss as a use of knowledge. Explain, use of knowledge. Name and locate, that could be knowledge and comprehension. Differentiate, knowledge and comprehension. Explain, that's use of knowledge. Name and locate, knowledge and comprehension. Although it could also come with the location part of the practical skills, right? Define, knowledge and comprehension. Describe, of course, knowledge and comprehension. Discuss, use of knowledge. So you could use this as a guide to help plan your respective questions, right? And then question 4 is what we call human natural systems integration question, right? Where essentially it tests a lot on disparity and environmental degradation, right? But the CXC over the years has have used the opportunity to test extra topics in either the section B or the section C of the syllabus, but leading up to the environmental degradation. So they and a lot of times they've asked about coral reefs, about specific about coral reefs, and then led into how has coral reefs been threatened and how they could be saved. Same thing, and that's under natural system, or even with population. They could ask about population and then ask about how can deforestation, because they need more land to house people, or how can tourism lead to environmental degradation, or how could secondary activities lead to pollution. So under this, you would see specifics on agriculture, quarrying and mining, and tourism as ways in which how those activities can cause environmental degradation. But also be mindful that these same things, like you see, like coral reef destruction, coral reef is under Section B. There are aspects of Section B, like mangroves, coral reefs, even vegetation, natural vegetation, that can be negatively impacted by human activities. So that is why in some cases, some of the natural systems questions or topics, coral reefs, mangroves, tropical vegetation, even hazards, those that have some sort of phenomena that is natural realm, if there's an element of human degradation threatening it or ways that they could save them, those could be tested in question 4. So it's important to know these kind of questions. So they can be relatively easy questions, but they could also be very technical depending on how they bring the question and what topics they're asking. But just like in question 3, question 4, again, with all of them, first 5 marks, practical skills. You can give you a diagram to draw, or a sketch map to draw, or illustration to interpret or draw, or label. They can ask you definitions. What is pollution? What is environmental degradation? Or they can ask you a technical question from section B, or even section C. Once it is related to the concept that they're going to test you further on. Use of knowledge. Explain some of the problems associated with deforestation, or how can interrelationships, how can tourism contribute to coral reef degradation? How can agriculture contribute to coral reef degradation? How can agriculture affect fishing? Those kind of interrelationships. Important to know those things, right? Going back to the structure of the syllabus, other aspects that you need to be that you can be mindful of in terms of the practical skills, photographs. They can bring photos and ask you questions on the photographs. You should be able to know. Weather systems, weather maps can come in the question 2, and you need to know your weather symbols. Even though they tell you don't need to know the weather station models, still know how to interpret them. Do you know your symbols for the cold fronts and tropical waves and the hurricanes? And you need to know your symbols. Also, climographs, be able to interpret them. Probably even draw one if they give the data, right? For location and time, well, that's really more for multiple choice. But you need to know how to name and locate your countries in the Caribbean. They can ask you it as a normal question 2. Identify the countries on a map that have volcanoes, right? So they may have an arrow pointing to a country that has a volcano. Name the country, right? So you need to know your countries in the Caribbean. Be able to sketch. Remember, if you ask to sketch any map, your map elements must be there. Title, directional arrow, key, scale, not drawn to scale, right? Illustrate features, tables and graphs. So of course, you must be able to know how to draw a table, a bar graph, a line graph, a divided circle, climate graphs. The dot maps, they haven't really brought dot maps ever at this level. I'll be surprised, but if they do, it to be a simple construction. Remember, each dot represents a certain number of people, and how you put the dots where the information, based on the information given to you, right? So just be mindful of those things moving forward with the practical skills that could come in the general paper 2, in any part of the paper 2. Finally, answering your questions. Be mindful of your action words, your key action words in the questions, right? Your practical skills, map reading skills, your ability to interpret and draw diagrams and figures and maps and statistical illustrations, knowledge and comprehension, defining and recalling facts and terms, describing processes, describing interactions, and explaining geographical features, processes comes under use of knowledge, explain as being interpreting information as well. So some of the key words, and again, all of this is on the classroom. Be mindful, they know what to do with name, list, identify, state, what is, define. At the CSEC level, you do not have to answer your questions in full sentences. You could just, if they ask for 2, put 1, this, 2, that. You just have to list. You don't have to be in proper sentences, right? Name, list, identify. They may ask you to name 2, name 3, list 2, name 3, identify this, state that, what is, define. Generally dependent if it's a definition question for 2 marks, they're looking for 2 points in the definition. They're listing 2 things, 2 marks with it. be specific, right? Be specific. If they want you to list two features, don't just say like list or state two conditions for coral reef formation. Don't just say water temperature or water depth. Say shallow water or warm water. Be specific as possible. Don't be broad. If it is an explanation question and you put the broad headings and then you explain, that's a difference. But if they ask you to state or to name conditions or features, be as specific as possible in your specifying in terms of listing, identifying, stating, whatever the case may be, right? Account. You might see the word account for a use of knowledge question. Account for the formation of volcanoes at plate margins. Basically, a broad way of saying, basically asking you, basically give the reasons why volcanoes are found at certain plate margins and why they're not found at others. Just a broad reason, right? This broad reasons. Another word you'll see is outline. Outline is in between a stating of something and describing something. So if they outline the conditions for coral reef formation, if they were asked you to state two conditions of coral reef formation, you might say warm water, shallow water. But if you're asked for outline, you might say warm water temperatures between this and that. Full stop. That's it. Or shallow water depths not more than 30 meters. That's it. That's an outline. So the outline is where is usually in a sentence form, statement form, where you basically provide, you say this, and they give a little, that's all. And generally, it typically will be, although I put it as use of knowledge, most times they've asked it as knowledge of comprehension, but they have time to time, depending on what they ask, they have asked it under a use of knowledge question. Discuss. It is rare, based on current and recent trends, it is rare to see the word discuss at the CSEC level. But if it is, I would still advise that you treat it as an explanation question, where you basically, because in most cases when discuss, you generally give pros and cons. So if it is, you have that, or to evaluate, you generally do two sides of the spectrum of a particular issue, right? But in most cases, as I said, based on trends, you would have seen the word discuss specifically probably 2 or 3 times within the syllabus. And probably in those areas, you probably could look out for the word discuss. But in most cases, I would treat it like an explanation question, right? Explain, elaborate on how something works, provide reasons, right? Chronological order, if applicable. If the process, how does something form? This must happen before this must happen. Because if you ask them, for example, explain how a volcanoes form, you must talk about what happened at the plate margin first. So the subduction zone, the denser oceanic plate subducts between the continental plate, the leading edge of the oceanic plate starts to partially melt, form molten material or magma, then force under pressure rises to the surface. So step by step. You can't just say, well, volcanoes are formed because molten material comes up the surface. Okay, how did the molten material form in the first place? That must be part of the explanation. So explanation is where you will state something, but you have to elaborate. And where possible, and sometimes the questions may ask you with the examples, specify. The examples they're looking for are sometimes from the case studies and information that you would know from a particular country, right? Describe, basically, if you were to tell somebody to describe a stack, what are the features of it? How would you tell somebody, well, it's a tall rock formation that basically appears beyond the high tide mark, right? And basically it formerly was part of a headland. You describe it. You didn't explain anything how it reached there. You describe how it looks like. So it's basically you just given an idea of how the feature looks like to the examiner. It looks like this. How does a meander look? A meander is a bend in a river channel. And even if you want to say due to erosion, that's that description. Oxbow Lake is a loop that is no longer part. That's a description. We ain't talking about the explanation here. If you are asked to explain, particularly for natural systems, I always recommend that you describe the feature as well. You get marks for it as well. So anytime you're asked to explain the formation of any feature or any phenomena, always provide a description of the feature. marks will be awarded. And even if you want to get that one, a diagram, a simple diagram, well labeled, annotated diagram will always go a long way. Annotate, if you ever ask to annotate, rare, seen it, not seen it in a long while, you have to fully label and note certain diagrams. If you're asked to label, they may have labels pointing to the features. You identify what are the different features being identified. If you're asked with the aid of a diagram, illustrate, you are using a diagram to illustrate the main features of something. You're not explaining anything, you're not writing anything. So they ask you to draw a diagram to illustrate a transform boundary. You draw the two plates, you show the arrows, you will probably label one plate 1 or plate A, plate B, and you show the direction, and you probably show in the middle that the plates slide past each other. So I know that's illustrating. You're writing what is it is illustrating. If they ask you the aid of a diagram, explain or describe something in conjunction with your write-up, your diagram has to show what you're saying. Sometimes CXC will give you the marks still if you write everything in the diagram, but something depending on how large you write, you may not be able to do that. So most times try to draw the diagram and then write after or before. And specifically, if they want you to have a diagram in the question, they will have a space specifically for the diagram. So use that space with it. If it is that there's no space for a diagram and they don't ask for one, you could, if you have space, then draw a diagram. You will not lose marks if you don't put a diagram if the question then asks for one. But credit will be given if you are provided you have the space, right? And sometimes comparisons are not only differences, it could be similarities. So, right? So if they ask to compare, if there are similarities, put the similarities. If there are differences, put the similarities. But always use headings. That is why under agriculture, when you're comparing peasant and commercial arable farming, there are always headings. If you're ever asked to compare, even your case studies with Caribbean versus China, India, Nigeria, or even with comparing CARICOM food processing with Singapore, headings. Use your headings. Learn your headings. It makes your comparison easier. And don't just say higher, lower. Use specific information, right? Classify, you already get that. Prove, you already get that. Draw, sketch, of course, you will get that sometimes. Make sure it's a neat, simple. Don't try to be elaborate. Simplicity is always it. But remember your labels. Clearly label when it needs to be labeled and identify that needs to be identified, right? So I always tell students when you're reading your question ends by the number of marks. Look for your key question words. Describe, explain, account, list, name. Quantity, most times it's specified, particularly with the describe or explain. What's the concept, right? What's the number of marks? If the number of marks is 6 and they ask for 3, divide the number of marks by the quantity. If you don't see a quantity and you look at the number of marks to determine how many points you need to have. So for a definition, if they ask you to define something for 2 marks, they're looking for 2 key points in your definition, right? So if you ask them about weathering, the breakup of rocks will give you a mark. In situ, the next mark. 2 concepts must be in that definition, right? Even if it is a description feature of the whatever it is, it's part of the definition, put it, right? So you don't, and in case, in all of your questions, particularly the larger mark questions, the number of marks for the question is going to be lower down on the paper. So the question is going to be up, and then you're going to see all the lines in between, and then the number of marks is going to be the end of the question with the lines. Look, when you finish reading the question, go down to see how many marks it is, right? So basically, you'll have an idea how much you need to write, okay? Tense of question is important, particularly with the human geography questions. Sometimes they may ask you what has been done, what is being done, what can be done, answer to suit. If the question is what is being done or what has been done, it's a case study. It has to be an example of what has been doing. If it's what could be done, then you could suggest possible reasons, plausible reasons that could be used in the future. So you look at your tense. In a named country, or sometimes they say, using an example, be specific. If you're talking about agriculture, don't just say in Trinidad. The whole of Trinidad is not in agriculture. In Parliament, Trinidad. In Aranguez, Trinidad. in the northeastern part of Guyana, on the coastal plain of Guyana, use the specific. If you're talking about any sort of activity, population, urbanization in Port of Spain, Trinidad, rural areas in Toco, Trinidad, don't just say in Trinidad. Be specific. So that's why they say in a name. They say they're looking for where in the named country, in a named country. So in whatever part of or whatever country, specify what's the applicable one, right? If it's bauxite, it has to be a tongue applicable for bauxite, Mandeville, for example. So be careful that even when they say the word using an example, same concept, right? So with your answers, remember, let it be free flowing, sequential order, makes sense. Let it be legible. Your handwriting, they can't understand what you're writing, but then they can't mark it. Use the geographical terms. Please use subduction. Don't use the word sink under the next one. Use subduction. Use the geographical terms that you've been introduced to. With the sketches and maps, I'm gonna tell you, be tidy, be simple. Remember with maps, elements must be there. Graphs, remember if it's a line graph, it may have to have a scale, unless they give you one. Right, bar graph thing. For the key, for even if it's with your pie chart, if you ask to draw a pie chart, right? What are the different sectors of the pie chart? Make a symbol, chart, whatever. Put a key. Put your calculations for your pie chart in terms of outer 360. Measure your angles. They get marks, all of that as well. And errors, remember, don't white off. And if you have to make a error correction, draw a straight line through the error, move on. If you have to answer the entire question behind, then do so. Make a cross a line and then use the extra page at the back of the booklet. Right? Final things moving forward. Tomorrow, walk with your Ziploc bag, clear Ziploc bag. Ensure you have at least 2 blue or blacking pens, 2 pencils, preferably the wooden pencils, not the push points. Right? Eraser, sharpener, long ruler, 30 centimeter, your protractor, compass, calculator, and your string. Right? Nothing else you really would need. Right? And the final tips with your strategy. Answer the 4 questions in order of weakness. Answer your strongest questions first and go down the line. And I use the word weakness very loosely. It's whichever one might be tedious, whichever one you might have some thinking to do. And that's why my second point there. Thinking requires time. Some students spend 20 minutes thinking, writing, and they even respond to the question yet because they're trying to remember. The time you're trying to remember is time that is going by. You must have a strategy in place. So manage that thinking time. Attempt all questions. It is better to at least attempt each of the 4 questions than trying to go question 1, then question 2, then question 2, because sometimes, because of the thinking and the time being used, you might only end up finishing 1 and 2, but you didn't finish question 3 and you didn't do question 4. Because remember, each question testing skills. Each question is testing each of the 3 skills. And if it is that you only answer 2 questions fully, and you're hoping that you answer them properly, then the other skills are not going to be, you're not going to get marks for your other skills. So each of your 4 questions must be tested. Even if you don't finish each of the questions, attempt all of them, right? Your exam is 150 minutes, not in any time. My advice, and this is just my advice, use the first 5 to 10 minutes to be pre-reviewing the paper. Determine, okay, or going through the paper booklets, okay, I see if I could do this one first, I could do this one second. Mentally put that in mind. Start writing on your points, right? If it is the map work you want to do first, do the map work first. But mentally commit yourself to the order and how you answer the questions, right? And then once you do that, I would allocate in the first instance 50 minutes for question 1, 30 minutes for question 2, 30 minutes for question 3, and 30 minutes for question 4. If you do question 4 first, and that's your strongest question, and you spend 20 minutes, as you can see in my guide here, that 10 minutes you save, add to the pool to then tackle another question. So you're going in the next question. If you're doing question 2 seconds, you have your 30 minutes that you allocate, and you have 10 minutes in your pool. So that you're saving your time for your more tedious and your weaker question for last. Who knows, you might have a whole 40, 50 minutes to do your last question for because you have all that time to plan and whatever the case will be. So have a game plan in place and how you're going to approach each of the questions. If you're doing question 1 first, set your time to 50 minutes. And after 50 minutes, move on. And hopefully you can finish all the others in time to come back. Commit yourself to whatever time you're focusing on with the question, stick to it. Move on and come back if time is available. Just make sure they answer all your questions. Go with a watch, stick to the time you're committing to, and you should be able to do everything. Do not panic. You start to panic, you start to sweat, it's time to you look around, you see people writing, you start that time consuming. Right? You can do this once you're properly prepared, both by the knowledge and with your exam strategy. Right? All the best tomorrow, gentlemen.